Hello, YouTube, and welcome back to another book review from me, your host, Logan Albright. Today is the fourth and final week of spooky stories for a spooky season, and I'm wearing my traditional Halloween orange again because we're fast approaching the greatest day of the year, Halloween. And I have yet another collection of horror-themed short stories to review for you today. And today I'm going to talk about The White People and Other Stories by Arthur Machen. This is an edition from Call of Cthulhu Press, which at least used to put out collections of authors who were influential on the Cthulhu mythos and setting up that whole kind of world building of these horror stories. People like Algernon Blackwood and Robert Chambers, and other people like that who were people who had kind of written things that inspired Lovecraft and that got Lovecraft to start writing in the way he did. And Machen was one of the early ones. He was a Welsh writer, and that's one of the things that attracted me to him because I am obsessed with Welsh, all things Welsh and Wales-based. And he was kind of fascinated by the old pagan traditions of his country and the fairy lore and things like that. And I love all that stuff. So I'm very interested in Machen. And I've known about him for a while, and I've reviewed some of his other books on this channel. I've reviewed his novella called The Three Impostors, which was in the first volume of this. This is the second collection of his work. And The Three Impostors is great, and there's a story in that collection also called The Great God Pan, which is one of his most famous stories, and is also very, very good. And The White People, the title story in this collection, was regarded by Lovecraft as one of the finest horror stories ever written, and I was very interested to read this. I was excited about it, and in being completely honest with you, my dear viewers, because that's what I do, I have to be honest with you on this channel, I was a little bit let down by this collection. Although I loved the first collection of his work, these felt like a little bit more minor pieces for the most part. And there are things in here that I think are very good, but overall the collection was a little uneven and not everything in it was great. A lot of the stuff in the collection is from his later period, which kind of gets into like 1915, and he had sort of abandoned to a certain extent his kind of obsession with fairies and pagan gods in the old world and tried to do something a little bit more grounded. He was very sensitive to criticism that he was kind of copying Robert Louis Stevenson's style, and he tried to do something a little bit more grounded in reality, which I don't find as interesting. And a lot of his later works had to do with the Great War, also known as World War I, which, was obviously a big source of inspiration for people living in Europe or in Britain at the time. He wrote a lot of horrific stories about that. Although I will say, as a collection of horror stories, these are not particularly scary. I find them more similar to like wonder tales, like the Tales of Lord Dunsany or someone like that, for example. There's some creepiness to them. There's some weirdness to them. There's some eeriness to them, but they're not really horror stories in the traditional sense for the most part. They some of them will leave you kind of unsettled, but I wouldn't really call them scary. So that was a little bit of a letdown as well. But let's talk about The White People. The White People is a very good story. I would not rate it quite as highly as Lovecraft. I wouldn't call it one of the greatest of all time, but it's a very enigmatic story that is framed by a conversation about the nature of sin, and then by way of illustration, one of the characters hands the other one this green manuscript in a green book that is written by a little girl, and she kind of tells about her experiences out in the forest in the native landscape of her country and experiencing all sorts of weird, inexplicable things out there in the forest. And it's very dreamlike, and it's very ambiguous what actually happens. There's a lot of scholarly interpretations of what it means. I'm not going to venture to explain it or say whether I agree with those interpretations, but there's a lot of just kind of strange occurrences out in the woods that seem to have some kind of pagan significance or some kind of witchcraft significance. And it's about, this little girl who experiences this stuff and doesn't quite know what she's experiencing and is trying to capture it and write it down in her diary, essentially. And there's a lot of words and phrases and names that she uses that are made up by Machen and are unfamiliar to the reader. There's some legitimate occult terms in there, and it kind of gives it this, depth, this feeling of reality by having all these strange terms that you're not familiar with. You're like, what is that? It sounds like a real occult secret, but I'm not sure if it actually is or not. And that was very influential on Lovecraft, kind of writing about the Necronomicon and all the names of his elder gods and things like that. So it's an enigmatic story, and it's a creepy story, and I think it's very good. I would not rank it as one of the greatest horror stories of all time, but it is quite interesting. But even more interesting to me than that story is a collection in here of little vignettes called Ornaments in Jade, and there are 10 of them, and they're only a couple pages each. and it's kind of collected from various magazines and stuff and published as a little, mini collection of vignettes called Ornaments in Jade. And they're like 1 or 2 page little short stories about nature, about society, and they're very suggestive. They're similar to the White People in that they don't really spell things out for you. You have to do a lot of work as a reader to imagine what's going on in these stories. They're very vague. But there's ones about witchcraft, and there's ones about, there's one called Torture that I particularly like, and, something sinister is about to happen, but they don't exactly explain what it is. And I like that kind of writing is very good because it leaves room for you, the reader, to insert your imagination into the story and figure out what's going on for yourself or not, or just enjoy it as a little, the person who writes the introduction, who's like an anthologist of a lot of Lovecraft's work, calls them prose poems. Doesn't really call them stories, he calls them prose poems. And that's an interesting way of looking at them, because a poem's function is not to convey information or tell a narrative. A poem's function is to kind of convey a feeling or an emotion or a snatch of time, a photographic kind of snapshot of something. And that's kind of what these stories do. So I really liked Ornaments in Jade. I think they're excellent, and they're the highlight of the collection for me, along with The White People. There's another story in the beginning called The Red Hand, which is sort of a detective story, an occult detective story. It reminds me very much of the Sherlock Holmes stories, but it features the 2 characters from the Three Impostors novella, which I've talked about before, as for kind of reprising their roles as paranormal investigators. But yeah, the form and function of that is a little bit like a Sherlock Holmes story. I found it slightly too contrived to be able to fully enjoy it. The theory of how to solve the mystery was not something that really rang true to me. So I kind of struggled with that. So apart from The White People and the Ornaments in Jade, the rest of the stories I found much less interesting. They're largely about the Great War, and but there is a lot of reference to kind of the Welsh homeland and going back from the city to like the rural Welsh countryside. And I really do like that as someone who's kind of fascinated by Wales and by the Welsh language and Welsh culture. There's a few snatches of Welsh language in here that I enjoyed trying to translate. So, I like that kind of ethnic feel to it, in the sense of him being true to his Welsh ethnicity. That's hard to say, Welsh ethnicity. So I really do love Arthur Machen, but this is not his finest work. I think his finest work is kind of confined to a few stories in that novella. And I would recommend getting the first volume of this, The Three Impostors and Other Stories, rather than this one. And if you really like that one and you want to read more, then get this one second. But if you are a fan of him, it's certainly worth checking out for those prose poems, I would say. So that's my review of The White People and Other Stories by Arthur Machen. I think this was also collected by Penguin Classics, so you can get it through them as well if you like that publisher. This publisher doesn't really seem to be active anymore, which is a shame. And if you liked this review, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications. If you have things to say about Arthur Machen and his legendarium, please leave them in the comments down below. I'd be interested to get your thoughts. And remember, my book, Libertarian Paganism, Freedom and Responsibility in Nature-Based Religion, is being released tomorrow. It will be available through the publisher, Collective Ink Books, and I think Amazon is getting them in America slightly later, like on November 1st, something like that. But you can pre-order, or you can order from the publisher and have it shipped tomorrow. So they are coming out. Get ready for that. And if you're interested in my work, please check out that book. I would appreciate it. I'll put a link in the description below. And that's what I think about The White People. So I don't know what I'm going to do next week. Next week will be the start of November, and I'm actually traveling for work at the beginning of that month. And so it's going to be difficult for me to release a video. I'm also starting National Novel Writing Month next month in November, and that's going to take up a lot of my time, and I'll be traveling on the day that I release a video. So I don't know that I'll get anything out next week. I'm going to try to, but it may not be possible. So I'll try to come up with something, but if I'm not around next week, don't worry, I'll be back the following week, and we can talk about National Novel Writing Month, or we can talk about whatever I've been reading and figure that out. But I might just take a little break, so we'll see. This month has been fun reading all these horror anthologies and stuff, but it's been a lot of work to kind of keep up with the schedule of reading a new book every week and posting something. So we'll see what happens. But thanks so much for watching. I've been your host, Logan Albright, and I will catch you next time.